The rain drummed against my windshield as I pulled up to the upscale apartment complex on Fifth Avenue. 23 years of driving taxi and now Uber had taught me to read passengers within seconds of them sliding into my back seat. But when the elderly woman opened my door that Tuesday evening, something felt different. Her silver hair was perfectly styled despite the weather, and her navy coat spoke of money, yet her hands trembled as she fastened her seatbelt. "Good evening," I said, checking my phone for the destination. The screen showed only St. Mary's Hospital with no additional notes. She settled into the leather seat with a quiet sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades. In my rear-view mirror, I caught her staring out at the city lights beginning to flicker on as dusk settled over Manhattan. "Take me to the hospital," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle hum of the engine. I adjusted my mirror to get a better look at her face. Her eyes held a strange mixture of resignation and peace that I'd seen before, usually in passengers heading to say final goodbyes. "It's my last day," she added, the words hanging in the air like morning fog. I felt my chest tighten. In all my years behind the wheel, I'd transported countless souls to hospitals, airports, and life-changing moments. Some chatted nervously, others sat in contemplative silence, but this woman radiated something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't despair or fear, it was more like quiet acceptance mixed with an odd sense of anticipation. As I pulled away from the curb and merged into the evening traffic, I found myself stealing glances at her reflection. She clutched a small leather purse in her lap and continued staring out the window, as if memorizing every building, every street corner, every face we passed. If you've ever wondered how a single ride can change everything, hit that subscribe button and stay with me for this incredible journey. The traffic on Madison Avenue moved like molasses, giving me more time to observe my mysterious passenger. Eleanor Whitmore, that was the name on my app, sat with the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime in boardrooms and charity galas. Yet something about her stillness suggested she was saying goodbye to all of it. I'd driven enough people to their final destinations to recognize the signs. "Beautiful evening, despite the rain," I offered, hoping to break the heavy silence that had settled between us. She turned from the window, and for the first time I saw her face clearly in the mirror. She was probably in her 70s, with the kind of elegant bone structure that spoke of good genes and better living. But her eyes held stories, deep, complex stories that most people never get to tell. "Yes, it is beautiful," she replied, her voice carrying a slight tremor. "I've always loved the city in the rain. Makes everything look softer, more forgiving." She paused, her fingers working nervously at the clasp of her purse. "Driver, may I ask your name?" The formality of her speech suggested old money, the kind of upbringing where please and thank you were as natural as breathing. "Michael," I said, taking the turn onto Park Avenue. "Michael Santos. Been driving in this city for over 2 decades. I watched her nod approvingly in the mirror. There was something almost maternal in her expression, as if she were cataloging details about me for some unknown purpose. The hospital was still 15 minutes away in this traffic, and I found myself oddly reluctant to reach our destination. She smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face. "Michael Santos. That's a good, strong name. I imagine you have children?" The question caught me off guard. Most passengers either ignored me completely or made small talk about the weather, but Eleanor Whitmore seemed genuinely interested in my answer, as if my story mattered to her in some profound way. "2 daughters," I found myself saying, though I rarely shared personal details with passengers. "Sophia's 26, just finished her residency at Mount Sinai. Isabella's 23, teaching elementary school in Brooklyn." Pride crept into my voice, as it always did when I talked about my girls. They'd both worked their way through college while I drove nights to pay for their education. Eleanor's face lit up with genuine delight. "A doctor and a teacher. You must be incredibly proud." She leaned forward slightly, her earlier melancholy momentarily forgotten. "I never had children of my own. My late husband and I, well, it just wasn't meant to be. But I've always believed that the measure of a parent is in what their children choose to give back to the world." The sincerity in her voice caught me off guard. Most wealthy passengers who climbed into my back seat treated me like part of the upholstery, present but invisible. Eleanor spoke to me like I was someone worth knowing, someone whose life had value beyond the service I provided. It was a rare gift, that kind of recognition, and I felt myself responding to it despite my usual professional boundaries. "They're good girls," I said, navigating around a double-parked delivery truck. "Smarter than their old man, that's for sure. Sophia wants to specialize in pediatric oncology, says she wants to give sick kids the kind of hope she never had to need." I caught myself sharing more than I intended, but something about Eleanor's presence made the words flow naturally. "And what about you, Mrs. Whitmore?" I asked, reading her name from my phone. "What brings you to the hospital this evening?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, and I immediately regretted the intrusion. But instead of the polite deflection I expected, Eleanor's expression grew thoughtful, as if she were deciding whether to trust me with something important. Eleanor was quiet for several long moments, her gaze returning to the rain-streaked window. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of carefully guarded secrets. "I'm going to see someone I should have visited years ago, someone who probably doesn't even know I exist." She paused, her fingers still working at her purse clasp. "Do you believe in redemption, Michael? In the possibility of making amends for old mistakes?" The question hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we should cross. I'd had philosophical conversations with passengers before. Late-night rides often brought out people's deepest thoughts, but something about Eleanor's tone suggested this wasn't academic curiosity. This was personal, urgent, and tinged with the kind of regret that keeps people awake at night. "I think it's never too late to try," I said carefully, slowing for a red light. "My own father. He left when I was 12. Came back when Sophia was born, wanting to make things right. Took me years to forgive him, but I'm glad I did. He got to know his granddaughters before he passed." I glanced in the mirror and saw Eleanor nodding slowly, as if my words confirmed something she'd been hoping to hear. "That gives me hope," she said softly. "I've carried this burden for 47 years, Michael. 47 years of wondering what if, of living with a choice I made when I was young and scared and foolish." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and I saw her dab at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Tonight, I finally have the courage to face the consequences." The light turned green, and as we moved forward through the intersection, I found myself deeply curious about Eleanor's story. What could a woman of her obvious refinement and grace have done that required nearly 5 decades of guilt? What secret had she carried all these years, and why was tonight the night she'd chosen to confront it? "I was 23, Eleanor began, her voice taking on the distant quality of someone revisiting painful memories. "Fresh out of Vassar, engaged to a man my parents adored. Richard came from the right family, had the right connections, the right bank account. On paper, he was perfect." She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "I thought I loved him, or maybe I loved the idea of the life he represented." I navigated through the increasingly heavy traffic, giving her space to continue. In my years of driving, I'd learned that sometimes people needed a stranger's ear more than they needed a destination. Eleanor seemed to be working up to something significant, each word carefully chosen, as if she were building toward a revelation she'd never spoken aloud. "But then I met James," she continued, and suddenly her voice changed entirely. Where it had been formal and controlled before, now it carried warmth and longing. He was everything Richard wasn't: spontaneous, passionate, completely wrong for someone like me. He worked construction, had calloused hands and dreams bigger than his paycheck. My parents would have disowned me if they'd known. She fell silent again, lost in memories that were clearly both precious and painful. I could see her reflection in the window, and the woman staring back at me looked decades younger, as if remembering James had somehow transported her back to that 23-year-old girl who'd faced an impossible choice. "We had 3 months together," she whispered. 3 perfect, secret months. And then she stopped abruptly, her hand moving to her throat as if the words were physically difficult to speak. Then I discovered I was pregnant, and everything changed. The choice I made that day has haunted me every moment since, and tonight I finally have the chance to see if I can make it right. The weight of Eleanor's confession settled over us like a heavy blanket. I'd heard many secrets in my back seat over the years: affairs, financial troubles, family disputes, but this felt different. This was the kind of secret that shapes an entire life, that creates ripples extending far beyond the initial choice. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter as I waited for her to continue. "I was terrified," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This was 1976, Michael. Things were different then, especially in my world. Unwed mothers were scandals to be hidden away, not celebrated. My engagement to Richard was announced in the society pages. The wedding invitations had been sent. My entire future was mapped out, and suddenly I was carrying another man's child." I caught her eye in the mirror and saw decades of pain reflected there. "What did you do?" I asked gently, though I suspected I already knew the answer. The pieces were falling into place, the guilt, the 47 years of regret, the hospital destination on what she called her last day. "I did what I thought was best for everyone," she said, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "I told James I needed space to think about my engagement. I never told him about the baby. Then I went to my parents and confessed everything. Well, almost everything. I told them I was pregnant but let them believe it was Richard's. They arranged a quiet ceremony, moved up the wedding date, and helped me create a fiction that would protect everyone's reputation." She paused to compose herself, dabbing at her eyes with the handkerchief. "But I couldn't go through with marrying Richard while carrying James's child. So I made the hardest decision of my life. I gave the baby up for adoption, broke my engagement, and told everyone I needed time to find myself. Then I spent the next 47 years wondering about the child I gave away. I never married," Eleanor continued, her voice steadying as she shared the weight of her story. "How could I? Every man I met, I compared to James. Every relationship felt like a betrayal of what we'd had, even though I was the one who'd walked away. I threw myself into charity work instead, trying to fill the void where my family should have been. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a woman who'd spent decades helping other people's children while mourning the loss of her own. I thought about my Sophia and Isabella, how my entire world revolved around their happiness and success. The idea of voluntarily giving up that connection, even for noble reasons, was almost incomprehensible. "Did you ever try to find them?" I asked. "The baby, I mean, or James." We were getting closer to the hospital now, and I found myself driving slower, reluctant to end this conversation. Eleanor's story was unfolding like a complex novel, and I needed to know how it ended. "I hired a private investigator 5 years ago," she admitted. "When I turned 70, I decided I was running out of time to make amends. It took him months, but he found them both." Her voice caught on the word both, and I saw her grip her purse tighter. "James never married either. He spent years looking for me after I disappeared, but my parents had moved me to Europe for a year. By the time I returned, he'd given up and moved to California." "And your child?" I prompted gently. We were only a few blocks from St. Mary's now, and I could see the hospital's lights through the rain. Eleanor straightened in her seat, as if preparing herself for what lay ahead. "A daughter," she whispered. "Her name is Catherine. She's 46 years old, married, with 2 children of her own. She's been a nurse at St. Mary's for 23 years, Michael. I've been watching her from afar for months, trying to work up the courage to introduce myself. Tonight is the night I finally stopped being a coward." As we pulled into the hospital's circular drive, I felt the weight of Eleanor's journey settling over both of us. The building loomed ahead, its windows glowing warmly against the dark sky. Somewhere inside those walls was a daughter who had no idea her birth mother was about to walk back into her life. The magnitude of what Eleanor was attempting took my breath away. "She doesn't know you're coming?" I asked, putting the car in park, but not ending the ride. This felt like a moment that required ceremony, not the abrupt conclusion of a typical Uber trip. Eleanor sat perfectly still, staring up at the hospital entrance, as if it were the gates of judgment itself. "No," she replied. "I've started letters 100 times, but never sent them. What do you say to a child you abandoned? How do you explain that you thought about her every day, but never had the courage to reach out? How do you ask forgiveness for a choice that probably saved her from a life of scandal, but cost both of you a lifetime of love?" I turned in my seat to face her directly, abandoning the professional distance I usually maintained with passengers. Mrs. Whitmore, Eleanor, can I tell you something my Sophia said when she was deciding on her specialty? She nodded, her eyes still fixed on the hospital. She said that healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about finding the courage to move forward despite the scars. Eleanor finally looked at me, and I saw something shift in her expression. The resignation was still there, but it was joined by something else. Determination, maybe, or hope.
Your daughter sounds very wise, she said. I hope Catherine got some of that wisdom despite growing up without me. There's only one way to find out, I said gently. But Eleanor, what did you mean when you said this was your last day? Are you... I couldn't finish the question, but she understood what I was asking. Eleanor's smile was sad, but peaceful. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer, she said simply. Diagnosed 3 months ago. The doctors gave me 6 months, but I can feel my body telling me it's time. I've been putting my affairs in order, making donations, writing letters to people who mattered. Catherine is the last piece of unfinished business. The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd suspected something serious when she mentioned her last day, but hearing it confirmed made everything suddenly urgent. This wasn't just about a mother seeking redemption, it was about final chances and last opportunities. The stakes couldn't be higher. Does she know, I asked, about your illness? Eleanor shook her head, and I saw fresh tears threatening to spill over. The complexity of her situation was staggering. She was about to introduce herself to a daughter who didn't know she existed, and potentially say goodbye in the same conversation. I don't want her pity, Eleanor said firmly. If Catherine chooses to reject me, I want it to be about the choice I made 47 years ago, not about guilt over a dying woman's last wishes. She deserves the right to be angry with me, Michael. She deserves the right to tell me that my abandonment hurt her, if it did. I won't take that away from her with a cancer diagnosis. I sat in stunned silence, processing the courage it must have taken for Eleanor to reach this decision. She was walking into the hospital prepared for rejection, prepared for anger, prepared for any response except pity. It was perhaps the most selfless act I'd ever witnessed, and it was happening in the back seat of my Uber. Will you tell her eventually? I asked. About the cancer? Eleanor was gathering her purse, preparing to leave, but she paused at my question. If she gives me the chance to be part of her life, even briefly, then yes. But first, I want to know who she is. I want to hear about her childhood, her dreams, her own children. I want one conversation where I'm just her birth mother, not a dying woman seeking absolution. Eleanor reached for the door handle, then stopped. Michael, would you do me an enormous favor? She turned back to face me, and I could see the fear she'd been hiding beneath her composed exterior. Would you wait for me? I don't know how this conversation will go, and I may need a ride home. Or, she paused, unable to voice the alternative. Of course, I said immediately. Take as long as you need. I'll be right here. I meant it completely. This wasn't about the fare anymore. It was about seeing Eleanor's story through to its conclusion. I'd become invested in her journey, and I couldn't abandon her now when she needed support most. She squeezed my shoulder gratefully. Thank you. You've been more than a driver tonight, Michael. You've been a friend. With that, she opened the door and stepped out into the rain. I watched her walk toward the hospital entrance, her posture straight and determined despite the emotional weight she carried. The automatic doors swallowed her up, and I was left alone with my thoughts and the lingering scent of her perfume. I turned off the engine and settled in to wait, my mind racing with possibilities. How would Catherine react? Would she be angry, curious, welcoming, or hostile? Did she even know she was adopted? Or would Eleanor's appearance be a complete shock? I found myself thinking about my own daughters, about the bond we shared, and the sacrifices I'd made to give them better lives. But those sacrifices paled in comparison to what Eleanor had done. She'd given up everything. Her child, her chance at love with James, her opportunity for a traditional family, believing it was best for everyone involved. Now, 47 years later, she was finally ready to face the consequences of that choice. Whether it led to reconciliation or heartbreak, she was determined to give Catherine the truth she deserved. As I sat in the hospital parking lot, rain drumming on my roof, I realized I was witnessing one of the most profound acts of courage I'd ever seen. 20 minutes passed, then 40.
I watched hospital staff come and go through the rain-soaked parking lot, each person carrying their own stories of healing, loss, and hope. Night shift nurses arriving for their rounds, doctors heading home after long days, families visiting loved ones. The hospital was a universe of human drama, and somewhere inside, Eleanor was having the most important conversation of her life. I tried to imagine what was happening. Had she found Catherine? Was she working up the courage to approach her? Or had they already met? The uncertainty was agonizing, and I wasn't even directly involved. I couldn't imagine what Eleanor must be feeling, facing the daughter she'd thought about every day for nearly 5 decades. My phone buzzed with ride requests, but I declined them all. I'd made a promise to wait, and more than that, I needed to know how this story ended. Eleanor had trusted me with her deepest secret, and I felt responsible for seeing her safely through this night, whatever the outcome. Around the 45-minute mark, I saw a familiar figure emerge from the hospital entrance. But something was wrong. Eleanor wasn't alone. A younger woman in scrubs was walking beside her, their heads bent together in intense conversation. Even from a distance, I could see the family resemblance. Catherine had Eleanor's elegant bone structure and graceful way of moving. They stopped just outside the entrance, still talking. I watched as Catherine reached out and touched Eleanor's arm, a gesture that seemed both tentative and caring. Whatever had happened in their first meeting, it hadn't ended in rejection. My heart began to race as I realized I was witnessing the reunion Eleanor had dreamed of for decades. The two women embraced then, a long, emotional hug that spoke of years of missing each other. I felt tears prick my own eyes as I watched a mother and daughter find each other after a lifetime apart. But their conversation wasn't over. They were still talking animatedly, and I could see Catherine wiping her eyes. After nearly an hour, Eleanor and Catherine began walking toward my car. As they got closer, I could see that both women had been crying, but their faces held joy rather than sorrow. Catherine was slightly taller than her mother, with auburn hair and the confident stride of someone accustomed to handling crises. When they reached the car, Eleanor tapped on my window. "Michael," she said, her voice bright with excitement, "I'd like you to meet my daughter, Catherine Morrison." The pride in her voice was unmistakable, and Catherine smiled warmly as she extended her hand through the window. "Catherine, this is Michael Santos, the angel who brought me here tonight." "Thank you," Catherine said, her handshake firm and warm. "Mom told me how kind you've been, listening to her story and waiting for her. That means more than you know." The word mom seemed to surprise even Catherine herself, and I saw Eleanor's face light up at hearing it. "How did it go?" I asked, though their expressions had already given me the answer. Eleanor and Catherine exchanged a look that spoke of shared understanding and mutual forgiveness. "Better than I ever dared hope," Eleanor replied. "It turns out Catherine always knew she was adopted, and she's been curious about her birth parents her entire life." Catherine nodded, still seeming slightly stunned by the evening's events. "I never imagined my birth mother would just walk into my workplace one day. When she introduced herself, I thought I was dreaming, but we've been talking, and..." She paused, looking at Eleanor with wonder. "I understand why she made the choice she did. It was an act of love, not abandonment." "There's more," Eleanor said, her voice taking on a new urgency. "Catherine, would you be willing to take a ride with Michael and me? There's someone else I think you should meet, someone who's been looking for both of us for a very long time." The mystery in her voice made both Catherine and me lean forward with curiosity. If you're as invested in this incredible story as I am, make sure to like this video and let me know in the comments what you think is going to happen next. This night is far from over. Catherine climbed into the back seat beside Eleanor, and I could feel the nervous energy radiating from both women. "Where are we going?" Catherine asked, fastening her seatbelt. Eleanor was pulling out her phone, scrolling through her contacts with trembling fingers. "To meet your father," Eleanor said simply. Catherine's intake of breath was audible in the quiet car. "James lives in Queens now. I called him while we were talking, and he's agreed to see us. He never stopped looking for me, Catherine. Even after all these years, he never gave up hope that we'd find our way back to each other." I started the engine, my mind reeling from this new development. What had begun as a simple ride to the hospital was turning into a night of miracles. A mother and daughter reunited after 47 years, and now a father who'd never stopped searching for the family he'd lost. The magnitude of what was unfolding was almost overwhelming. "He knows about me?" Catherine asked, her voice small. Eleanor nodded, reaching over to take her daughter's hand. "I told him everything when I called. About you, about my choice to give you up, about the years of regret and wondering. He cried, Catherine." This 70-year-old man broke down and cried because he finally knew what happened to us. As I navigated through the Queens-bound traffic, I listened to Eleanor and Catherine share the details of their lives. Catherine talked about her adoptive parents, who had loved her deeply but always encouraged her curiosity about her birth family. Eleanor shared stories about the charity work that had filled her childless years and the way she'd looked for Catherine's face in every young woman she met. "I have so many questions," Catherine said. "What was he like? What were you two like together? Do I have his eyes or yours?" Eleanor laughed, a sound of pure joy that filled the car with warmth. "You have his determination and his kind heart. But you got my stubborn streak. James used to say I could argue with a brick wall and win." The address Eleanor gave me led to a modest apartment building in Astoria. As we drove through the tree-lined streets, Eleanor shared more stories about James. How they'd met at a bookstore, their secret dates in Central Park, the way he'd made her laugh until her sides ached. Catherine hung on every word, hungry for details about the father she'd never known existed, until tonight. "He became a contractor," Eleanor explained. "Built schools and libraries, said he wanted to create spaces where people could learn and grow. After I disappeared, he threw himself into his work, but he never married. My investigator said he told people he was still waiting for someone." Her voice caught on the last words, and I saw her dab at her eyes again. "This is surreal," Catherine murmured. "This morning I was a single woman with no biological family, and tonight I'm about to meet both of my birth parents. I don't even know how to process this." She looked out the window at the passing streetlights, her reflection showing a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Are you okay with this?" Eleanor asked suddenly, as if the magnitude of the evening had just hit her. "We're moving so fast, and I don't want to overwhelm you. If you need time to think, to process everything, James will understand. We've waited 47 years. We can wait longer if you need us to." Catherine turned to face her mother, and I saw Eleanor's features reflected in her daughter's face. "I've been waiting my whole life for this moment," Catherine said firmly. "I'm not stopping now. Besides, I work in a hospital. I've learned that life is unpredictable, and when you get a chance at something precious, you take it." We pulled up to James's building, and I could see a figure silhouetted in one of the upper windows. Someone had been watching for our arrival. Eleanor noticed too, and she pressed her hand to her heart. "That's him," she whispered. "After all these years, that's my James." James was waiting in the lobby when we arrived, and the moment I saw him, I understood why Eleanor had never forgotten him. Even at 70, he was a striking man, tall and lean with silver hair and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime of honest work. But it was his eyes that caught my attention. They were the same warm brown as Catherine's, filled with decades of hope and longing. When Eleanor walked through the glass doors, time seemed to stop. James took a step forward, then another, until they were standing just inches apart. Neither spoke for a long moment. They simply looked at each other, drinking in the faces they'd carried in their memories for nearly half a century. Finally, James reached out and gently touched Eleanor's cheek. "Ellie," he said softly, using what was clearly an old nickname. "I knew you'd come back to me someday." Eleanor broke down then, all her composure crumbling as she fell into his arms. They held each other like drowning people clinging to life preservers, and I had to look away from the intimacy of their reunion. Then James noticed Catherine standing beside me, and his breath caught. "My God," he whispered, releasing Eleanor but keeping one arm around her waist. "She looks just like you did when you were young." He approached Catherine slowly, as if afraid she might disappear if he moved too quickly. "Catherine, is it really you?" "Hello, Dad," Catherine said, and the word seemed to surprise her as much as it clearly moved James. He opened his arms, and after a moment's hesitation, she stepped into them. I watched this man meet his daughter for the first time, saw the wonder and joy and overwhelming love in his expression, and I felt privileged to witness such a profound moment. "I have a daughter," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "After all these years of wondering, I have a daughter." He looked over Catherine's head at Eleanor, and the love in his eyes was so pure it took my breath away. "We have a daughter, Ellie. We're a family." James invited us up to his apartment, a cozy space filled with books and photographs of the buildings he'd constructed over the years. As we settled in his living room, I realized I was witnessing something extraordinary. The formation of a family that had been separated by time and circumstance, but never truly broken. "I never stopped looking for you," James told Eleanor as he served coffee with hands that still trembled slightly from emotion. "Every year on Catherine's birthday, I calculated when she would have been born, I'd put an ad in the personal section of the Times, just in case you were looking too." Eleanor's eyes widened with surprise and regret. "I saw those ads," she whispered. "For years I saw them, but I was too afraid to respond. I thought you'd hate me for disappearing, for not telling you about the baby. I thought I'd forfeited any right to your love when I made that choice." James sat beside her on the couch, taking her hands in his larger ones. "I could never hate you," he said firmly, confused, hurt, desperate to understand. "Yes, but never hate. You were 23 years old, Ellie, facing an impossible situation with no good options. I've had 47 years to think about it, and I understand why you did what you did." He looked at Catherine, who was curled in an armchair listening intently to her parents' story. Catherine leaned forward, her medical training evident in the thoughtful questions she asked. "What was your plan? I mean, if you'd stayed together, what would have happened?" It was James who answered, his voice carrying the weight of dreams long deferred. "I would have married your mother in a heartbeat. We would have raised you together, probably struggled financially, but we would have been happy. I had it all planned out." Eleanor began to cry again, but these were different tears. Tears of recognition for the life they'd all missed, but also tears of gratitude for this unexpected second chance. "I robbed us all of that," she said. "My fear, my concern about scandal and social expectations. I let them steal our family from us. But look at what Catherine became," James said, his voice filled with pride as he looked at his daughter. "A nurse, helping people, saving lives. Maybe our separation led her to the parent she needed, to the life that made her who she is today. Maybe everything happened the way it was supposed to." His generosity of spirit was remarkable, and I could see where Catherine had gotten her compassionate nature. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "My adoptive parents, the Morrisons, were wonderful people. Dad was a teacher, Mom was a librarian. They gave me a stable, loving home and always encouraged me to follow my dreams. I don't think I would have become a nurse without their influence." She paused, looking between Eleanor and James. "But I always felt like something was missing. Now I know what it was." Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a thick envelope. "I brought something for you," she said to Catherine. "Letters I wrote, but never sent. One for every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone I imagined you reaching. I know it can't make up for not being there, but I wanted you to know that not a day passed when I didn't think about you." Catherine accepted the envelope with reverent hands, her eyes filling with tears as she felt the weight of 46 years of love and longing. "You wrote to me every year?" she asked in wonder. Eleanor nodded, and James squeezed her hand supportively. "I did the same thing," he admitted. "I have a box full of letters to both of you. I guess we were all trying to bridge the distance in the only way we knew how." The three of them sat in comfortable silence for a moment, processing the magnitude of the silence in the hospital room was deafening. Sarah sat beside Marcus's bed, her hand gently resting on his arm as he slept. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic about his response to the emergency surgery, but the next 24 hours would be critical. She found herself studying his face, searching for signs of the vibrant man who had shared his deepest fears with her just hours earlier. Dr. Rodriguez entered quietly, checking the monitors with practiced efficiency. "His vital signs are stabilizing," she whispered to Sarah. "The surgery went better than we initially hoped. We were able to remove more of the tumor than anticipated, Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she knew they weren't out of the woods yet. The doctor's cautious smile offered hope where there had been none before. As the night wore on, Sarah found herself thinking about the strange chain of events that had brought them here. If Marcus hadn't gotten into her car, if he hadn't been brave enough to share his story, if she hadn't convinced him to fight, where would they both be now? The randomness of their meeting felt less like coincidence and more like destiny with each passing hour. Her phone buzzed with messages from her daughter asking about her whereabouts. Sarah realized she had been at the hospital for over 6 hours, never once considering leaving. Something about Marcus's courage had awakened something in her own heart, a reminder of what it meant to truly care about another human being's well-being. When Marcus stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open for just a moment, Sarah leaned closer. "I'm here," she whispered, and she meant it in every possible way. The next morning brought unexpected visitors to Marcus's room. Sarah had dozed in the uncomfortable hospital chair when she heard familiar voices in the hallway. Through the partially open door, she saw a young woman with Marcus's same gentle eyes speaking urgently with Dr. Rodriguez. Behind her stood an older man, his face etched with worry and what looked like years of regret. "I'm his daughter, Emma," the woman was saying. "We got the call from the hospital. I drove through the night from Portland." Sarah's heart skipped. Marcus had mentioned his estranged daughter, the one he thought would never forgive him. The older man introduced himself as Marcus's brother, Robert, whom Marcus believed wanted nothing to do with him after their father's business failed years ago. Sarah quietly gathered her things, feeling like an intruder in this family reunion. But as she moved toward the door, Emma noticed her. "Are you Sarah?" she asked softly. "The nurse mentioned you brought him in. You saved his life." The gratitude in Emma's voice was overwhelming, and Sarah found herself explaining how she had met Marcus, carefully omitting the more personal details of their conversation. Robert stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "We've been trying to find him for months. Emma hired a private investigator after she had her first baby. She wanted her father to meet his granddaughter." Sarah's eyes widened as the pieces fell into place. The family Marcus thought had abandoned him had been searching for him, wanting to rebuild the bridges he believed were permanently burned. As if summoned by their voices, Marcus's eyes opened slowly, focusing on the 3 faces surrounding his bed. The look of shock and wonder that crossed his features was something Sarah would never forget. The reunion was tentative at first, decades of hurt and misunderstanding hanging in the air like morning fog. Emma approached her father's bedside carefully, her eyes filled with tears she had been holding back for years. "Dad," she whispered, and the single word carried the weight of all their lost time. Marcus tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat, overwhelmed by seeing his daughter's face after so many years of believing she hated him. Robert cleared his throat, his own eyes moist. "Marcus, I owe you an apology. When the business went under, I blamed you for things that weren't your fault. I was angry and scared, and I said things." He paused, struggling with words that had needed to be spoken for over a decade. "Emma's been looking for you because she wanted to tell you something important. She never blamed you for Mum's accident. None of us did, except me, and I was wrong." Sarah watched from the corner of the room as Emma pulled out her phone, showing Marcus pictures of a beautiful baby girl with the same gentle eyes that seemed to run in their family. "Her name is Grace," Emma said softly. "She's 6 months old, and I want her to know her grandfather. I've wanted to find you for so long, to tell you that I understand why you left. I understand you thought you were protecting us from more pain." Marcus reached out with a trembling hand to touch the phone screen, his fingers tracing his granddaughter's face. The man who had gotten into Sarah's car, believing he was utterly alone in the world, was surrounded by family who had never stopped loving him. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Sometimes we have to face death to truly understand how much life we actually have. The healing that began in that hospital room would take time, but Sarah could see it starting in the way they looked at each other, tentative hope replacing years of assumed rejection. Over the next few days, Sarah found herself returning to the hospital regularly. What had started as concern for a passenger had evolved into something deeper, a connection to a family whose story had become intertwined with her own. She watched as Marcus grew stronger, not just physically, but emotionally, surrounded by the love he had convinced himself he had lost forever. Emma had taken leave from her job in Portland and was staying at a nearby hotel with baby Grace. The sight of Marcus holding his granddaughter for the first time had moved everyone in the room to tears. His hands, which had trembled with fear and medication just days before, held the tiny baby with infinite gentleness. "She's perfect," he kept whispering, as if he couldn't quite believe this miracle was real. Robert had flown back to Chicago to arrange time off from his own job, planning to return with his wife, who was eager to see Marcus again. The brothers had spent hours talking, filling in the gaps of their lost years, slowly rebuilding a relationship that had been fractured by grief and misunderstanding. Sarah marveled at how quickly love could resurface when given the chance, how family bonds could survive even decades of separation. Dr. Rodriguez had delivered cautiously optimistic news about Marcus's prognosis. While the cancer was aggressive, the early intervention had given them options they wouldn't have had if he had waited even another week. "Sometimes," she told Sarah privately, "the will to live makes all the difference in treatment outcomes. He has something to fight for now." Sarah realized that she, too, had found something to fight for. Watching this family heal had reminded her of the importance of connection, of not letting fear keep us isolated from the people who matter most. As Marcus's condition stabilized and his treatment plan was established, Sarah began to reflect on the extraordinary series of events that had brought them all together. She had always been skeptical of people who talked about fate or destiny, preferring to believe in random chance and personal choice. But the precise timing of Marcus's ride request, her decision to work late that particular evening, even the traffic pattern that had taken them past the hospital, it all seemed too perfectly orchestrated to be mere coincidence. During one of her visits, Marcus asked her a question that had been weighing on his mind. "Sarah, why did you stay? Most drivers would have dropped me off and forgotten about me within an hour. What made you care about a complete stranger?" She considered his question carefully, realizing she had been asking herself the same thing. The answer, when it came to her, was both simple and profound. "I think," she said slowly, "that we recognize something in people sometimes, a kind of pain or hope that mirrors our own. When you got in my car that night, you weren't really a stranger. You were someone who had given up on being seen, on mattering to anyone. I've felt invisible too, especially since my divorce. Maybe I stayed because helping you helped me remember that we all matter to someone." Their conversation was interrupted by Emma arriving with Grace, but Marcus's thoughtful expression told Sarah that her words had resonated with him. Later, as she watched Emma show her father how to properly burp the baby, Sarah felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with her driving rating or her tip earnings. She had been part of something larger than herself, something that would ripple forward in ways she might never fully understand. The randomness of human connection, she realized, might be the closest thing to magic that exists in the world. 3 weeks after that fateful night, Marcus was discharged from the hospital to begin outpatient treatment. The small apartment he had been living in seemed too lonely and isolated for his recovery, so Emma had convinced him to come stay with her in Portland, at least temporarily. Sarah helped them pack his few belongings, struck by how little physical evidence there was of a life that had been so rich in relationships and experiences. As they loaded the last box into Emma's car, Marcus turned to Sarah with an expression of gratitude that went beyond words. "I don't know how to thank you," he said simply. "You gave me back my life, but more than that, you gave me back my family." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she hugged this man who had started as a passenger and become something like family himself. Emma approached them, carrying Grace in her arms. "Sarah, I want you to know that you'll always be part of Grace's story. When she's old enough to understand, I'm going to tell her about the angel who saved her grandfather's life." The word angel made Sarah laugh through her tears. She had never felt less angelic than during those first moments of panic in her car. But perhaps that was the point. Sometimes, the most profound acts of grace come from our most human moments of uncertainty and fear. The drive to the airport was bittersweet. Sarah had offered to take them, wanting to extend their time together just a little longer. As they sat in traffic, Marcus shared his plans for treatment in Portland. His excitement about getting to know Grace, his hopes for rebuilding his relationship with Emma. The man who had whispered about his last day was now making plans for years to come. At the departure gate, as they said their final goodbyes, Sarah realized that this experience had changed her as much as it had changed Marcus. If you've been moved by this story of unexpected connections and second chances, please subscribe to hear more real-life confessions from passengers. Your support helps us share these powerful human stories. In the months that followed, Sarah found herself approaching her work differently. Each passenger who entered her car was no longer just a fare to be transported from point A to point B, but a human being carrying their own stories, struggles, and hopes. She began to listen more carefully to the conversations people had on their phones, to notice when someone seemed distressed or lonely, to offer small kindnesses that might make a difference in someone's day. Her relationship with her own daughter had also transformed. Inspired by the healing she had witnessed between Marcus and Emma, Sarah had reached out to bridge some of the distance that had grown between them since the divorce. They began having regular video calls, and Sarah shared the story of Marcus and his family, explaining how it had reminded her of what truly mattered in life. The updates from Portland were encouraging. Marcus's treatment was progressing well, and his doctors were optimistic about his long-term prognosis. Emma sent regular photos of Grace, who was growing rapidly and bringing joy to everyone around her. Robert had visited twice, and there was talk of a family reunion that summer, the first in over 15 years. But perhaps the most significant change was in Sarah herself. She had enrolled in a volunteer training program at the local hospital, inspired by the kindness she had witnessed from the medical staff who had cared for Marcus. One evening a week, she now spent time with patients who had no visitors, offering the same presence and compassion that she had given to Marcus during those critical first hours. Her supervisor at the volunteer program had commented on her natural ability to connect with people who were facing difficult circumstances. "You have a gift," she had said. But Sarah knew it wasn't a gift. It was a choice, made moment by moment, to see and respond to the humanity in others. 1 year later, Sarah received a call that brought her story with Marcus full circle. Emma was on the line, her voice excited and warm. "Sarah, I have wonderful news. Dad's latest scans came back clear. The doctors are calling it a complete remission. We're having a celebration, and we want you to be here. Your family now." The invitation to Portland was more than Sarah could have hoped for, but even more meaningful was the word family, a designation she had earned not through blood, but through love and presence during the darkest hour. The celebration was held in Emma's backyard, with Robert and his wife, several of Emma's friends, and neighbors who had embraced Marcus as part of their community. Grace, now walking and babbling constantly, toddled over to Sarah with the fearless affection of a child who had heard her name spoken with love and gratitude. Watching Marcus chase his granddaughter around the garden, his laughter carrying on the summer breeze, Sarah marveled at the transformation from the broken man who had whispered about his last day. During a quiet moment, Marcus approached Sarah with something in his hands, a small wrapped package. Inside was a silver bracelet engraved with the words, "Sometimes angels drive cars." His eyes were bright with unshed tears as he fastened it around her wrist. "I want you to remember," he said softly, "that you didn't just save my life that night. You taught me that it's never too late for love to find us, even when we've given up on ourselves." As the evening wound down and Sarah prepared to return to her hotel, she reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. A simple ride request had become a story of redemption, healing, and the profound impact that strangers can have on each other's lives. She thought about all the passengers she had driven since that night, wondering whose life might be changed by their next unexpected encounter. The drive back to the airport the next morning felt different from that anxious journey a year ago. Sarah was returning home not just as a rideshare driver, but as someone who had learned that the most ordinary moments can become extraordinary when we choose to truly see and care for one another. Comment below if you've ever had a chance encounter that changed your life. These stories remind us that miracles often come disguised as everyday moments, and sometimes the person sitting next to us needs exactly what we have to offer.